Everyone knows the name Eisenhower. Most people know the name Rommel. But almost no one knows what happened the moment those two names collided across a battlefield neither man had yet set foot on together. There was a conversation, or rather there was a reaction. A quiet, controlled, and deeply revealing moment when one of the most feared military commanders in history received word that his next opponent had just been named. And what Rommel said, what he thought, what he did next, tells you more about World War II than 100 textbook chapters ever could. If that sounds like a bold claim, stay with me, because what we're about to get into isn't just military history. It's the story of two men on a collision course that would decide the fate of Western Europe, told through the one moment when one of them finally understood what he was up against. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind that go deeper than the surface, that dig into the real moments and real decisions that changed the world, make sure you subscribe right now, because we do this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Let's set the scene. It's late 1943. The war has been going for 4 years. The Eastern Front is a grinding, catastrophic nightmare for Germany. Stalingrad already happened. Kursk already happened. The Wehrmacht is bleeding out in the snow and mud of the Soviet Union in a way that no amount of propaganda can fully hide from the men who are actually reading the casualty reports. In North Africa, the story is even cleaner and more brutal. The Afrika Korps, the legendary force that made Rommel famous across 2 continents, is gone. Surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943. Over 200,000 Axis troops captured in a single capitulation. It was the second largest surrender of the entire war, surpassed only by Stalingrad. And then Sicily fell, and then Italy. The Allies are moving, and everyone in Germany, from Hitler's inner circle down to the most junior staff officer, knows that the real blow is still coming. Not in Italy. Not in the Mediterranean, somewhere in France, somewhere along the Atlantic Wall. The question is not if, the question is where. And the other question, the one that keeps German commanders awake at night, is who. Rommel understands this better than almost anyone. By the winter of 1943, he has been assigned to inspect and then command the defenses of the Atlantic Wall, the massive network of fortifications, gun emplacements, obstacles, and troop positions that stretched from Norway down through Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and all along the French coastline to the Spanish border. Hitler called it an impregnable fortress. Rommel, who was brutally honest in private even when he was diplomatically careful in public, had a different view the first time he actually walked the length of it. He called it a farce. Not publicly, not in writing that would reach the wrong eyes, but to his staff, to his officers, to the men he trusted. He said it was largely a fiction, a collection of incomplete positions, poorly sighted guns, inadequate obstacles, and troops who in many sectors were either too old, too young, too badly equipped, or all three simultaneously. The legend of the Atlantic Wall was doing more work than the wall itself. Rommel knew that, and Rommel, being Rommel, immediately set about trying to fix it, because that was who he was. He didn't sit in headquarters and point at maps. He drove to the beaches. He walked the sand. He measured the tidal zones. He argued with engineers and overruled generals and ordered millions of obstacles to be planted in the surf zone where Allied landing craft would have to pass. He demanded mines, more mines, so many mines that his staff began referring to his vision of the beaches as the Devil's Garden. He wanted the Allied invasion to be broken on the beaches themselves, in the first hours, before any lodgment could be established. He had a very specific theory about this, one that put him in direct conflict with other senior German commanders, and we'll get to that in detail. But first, we need to talk about who was coming, because in December of 1943, that question was officially answered. On December 24, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt made a radio broadcast that was heard around the world. He announced that General Dwight D. Eisenhower had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower would command Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. The man who had organized and overseen the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, and the invasion of Italy was now being handed the biggest military operation in human history. And in the German command structure, that announcement landed like a stone in still water. The ripples went everywhere. Now, here's what you have to understand about the moment Rommel heard this news. Rommel was not a naive man. He was not a man who relied on propaganda or comfortable illusions. He was one of the most tactically gifted commanders of the entire war, a man who had faced British and American forces directly, who had studied Allied capabilities through the lens of hard combat experience, and who had a very clear-eyed view of what his army was actually capable of versus what Berlin said it was capable of. Those two things were very different. So when Rommel received word that Eisenhower had been appointed, his reaction was not dismissive. It was not the kind of sneering condescension that some German officers displayed toward American commanders in the early years of the war. That sense that the Americans were amateurs, that their generals were managers rather than warriors, that their soldiers were soft. Rommel had fought Americans in Tunisia. He knew better than that. What Rommel actually said, according to multiple accounts from his staff and his son Manfred, who later compiled his father's papers and recollections, was something measured and serious. He acknowledged Eisenhower as a proven organizer and a man of considerable political and strategic skill. He noted that Eisenhower's ability to hold together an alliance of different national armies, different personalities, different agendas, was itself a form of military genius that shouldn't be underestimated. He said, and variations of this appear in multiple sources, that the appointment of Eisenhower meant the Allies were serious, that they were committing their most capable administrator-commander to this operation, and that Germany needed to treat what was coming with absolute seriousness. There was no celebration in Rommel's headquarters. There was no dismissal. There was, by most accounts, a quiet and rather grim recognition that the game had changed. But to truly understand why that reaction mattered, you have to understand what Rommel thought of Eisenhower specifically, as opposed to Allied commanders generally. And to understand that, you have to go back to North Africa, because that's where the story of these two men really begins, even though they never met face-to-face on the battlefield there. Rommel arrived in North Africa in February of 1941 with a small German force initially sent to prop up the collapsing Italian position in Libya. Within weeks, he had launched an offensive that nobody had authorized, using initiative and speed and an intuitive grasp of armored warfare to drive the British back hundreds of miles. He captured generals. He seized supply depots. He moved so fast that his own supply lines couldn't keep up, which would eventually be his undoing. But in those early months, it was breathtaking. The British gave him the nickname the Desert Fox, partly out of genuine admiration, partly because it was easier to explain defeat at the hands of a genius than at the hands of a man who simply moved faster and thought more clearly than you did in a given situation. By 1942, Rommel had driven the British to within 60 miles of Alexandria. He was at El Alamein. He was closer to the Suez Canal than any Axis force had ever been. Winston Churchill, in Parliament, admitted that Rommel was a great general. That admission from a wartime prime minister about an enemy commander was almost unprecedented. And then the Americans arrived. Not just supplies, not just equipment, though the American material contribution to British forces in North Africa was already enormous. The Americans arrived as a fighting force in November of 1942, when Operation Torch landed Anglo-American armies in Morocco and Algeria, catching the Axis forces in a strategic vice. Eisenhower commanded Torch. He had planned it, organized it, argued for it, and executed it. It wasn't perfect. The initial American performance at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943 was a disaster by any objective measure. Rommel hit the inexperienced American Second Corps and shattered it, driving it back 50 miles and capturing enormous quantities of equipment. He wrote in his letters home that the Americans fought without coordination, without understanding of combined arms tactics, without the kind of discipline that comes from facing real adversity in real combat. He was, on that specific occasion, correct. But here is what made Rommel different from the other German commanders who drew the wrong lesson from Kasserine. He did not conclude that American soldiers were permanently incapable. He did not write them off. He noted, with the analytical precision that made him dangerous, that what he had fought at Kasserine was a Green Army in its first major engagement. He noted that the Americans had enormous material resources, a huge manpower base, and critically, the institutional capacity to learn from failure faster than almost any other army in the war. He said, according to his papers, that within 6 months the Americans would be a completely different fighting force. He was right. By May of 1943, when the campaign in Tunisia ended with that massive Axis surrender, the American Second Corps under George Patton and then Omar Bradley had transformed. They were still not the most refined tactical force in the theater, but they were aggressive, they were improving, and they were being supplied at a rate that no German formation could match or sustain. Rommel never fought in Tunisia himself. He was invalided out of Africa in March of 1943, sick, exhausted, suffering from the accumulated toll of 2 years of near-constant operational command in extreme conditions. He left before the final collapse. He never had to watch those 200,000 men go into captivity. But he knew it was coming. He had told Hitler it was coming. He had flown to the Wolf's Lair and told the Führer directly that Africa was lost, that the forces there should be evacuated, that throwing more men into Tunisia was throwing them away. Hitler refused. The men stayed. They were captured. And Rommel, who had done everything in his power to prevent it, had to live with that knowledge for the rest of the war. It hardened something in him. It gave him a very specific kind of clarity about what Germany could and could not do against the resources the Allies were bringing to bear. Which brings us back to December of 1943 and the announcement of Eisenhower's appointment. Because Rommel's reaction to that news was shaped by everything he had learned in North Africa, everything he understood about American industrial and organizational capacity, and everything he feared about the coming invasion. When he heard that Eisenhower was taking command, he was not hearing that a mediocre administrator had been given a job beyond his abilities. He was hearing that the man who had taken the enormous logistical and political challenge of Operation Torch and made it work, who had then organized the invasion of Sicily and the invasion of Italy, was now being pointed directly at France. And Rommel understood, in a way that some of his colleagues did not, what that actually meant. Eisenhower's reputation in the German intelligence community was interesting. The German assessment of Eisenhower, preserved in various OKW documents and intelligence summaries, was somewhat condescending on the surface. They noted his limited direct combat experience. They observed that he was not a battlefield commander in the way that Patton or Monty were. They characterized him primarily as a coordinator, a political general who could manage alliances and logistics, but who lacked the killer instinct of a true operational commander. And in a narrow, literal sense, they weren't entirely wrong. Eisenhower was not going to be personally directing tank battalions or standing on a ridge with binoculars during the invasion. That wasn't his job, and it never had been. But the German assessment missed something fundamental, something that Rommel, with his experience of what Eisenhower had actually built and deployed, understood more clearly than the analysts in Berlin. The ability to organize and sustain a coalition military operation at that scale was not a lesser form of military talent. It was a different form, and in the context of this particular war, in this particular moment, it might be the most important form of all. Because what was coming at France was not just a tactical problem, it was a logistical and strategic problem of almost incomprehensible complexity. You were going to take the better part of 2 million men, with all their equipment, their vehicles, their fuel, their ammunition, their food, their medical supplies, their communications gear, and move them across one of the most unpredictable bodies of water in the world, land them on a defended beach, establish a position, and then expand that position into a full-scale campaign that would ultimately have to cover hundreds of miles to reach Germany itself. That required not just brave soldiers, it required ships, and the Allies had them. It required aircraft, and the Allies had them in quantities that made Rommel genuinely sick with worry every time he looked at the Luftwaffe's actual operational numbers versus what the invasion force would bring. It required organization, coordination, deception, and the ability to keep an enormous and complicated enterprise moving forward, even when individual pieces of it were failing. That was Eisenhower's skill. That was what Rommel was acknowledging when he received the news of the appointment. Not just who the man was, but what the man represented. The full weight of Allied industrial and organizational power, aimed at France, commanded by someone who had proven he could make that machine work. Now, Rommel did not simply throw up his hands and conclude that defeat was inevitable. That was not his nature. He was not a defeatist, at least not in the operational sense. He was a fighter who believed in fighting. But he was also a realist, and his realism had been sharpened to a very fine edge by 2 years of watching Germany run out of everything, while the Allies got more of everything. His response to the Eisenhower appointment was essentially to redouble his efforts on the Atlantic Wall. If the invasion was going to come, commanded by the man who had proven he could make the Allied machine work, then Rommel needed to make sure that machine was broken on the beaches before it had a chance to start working in France. Everything depended on the first 24 hours. He said this repeatedly, to his staff, to the officers under his command, to his superiors, to Hitler himself. Everything depended on destroying the invasion on the beach. If the Allies got ashore and consolidated, if they got their logistics flowing and their breakout started, Germany would not be able to stop them. The numbers simply didn't exist. The aircraft didn't exist. The fuel didn't exist. The reserves didn't exist in the necessary strength. The only chance was to drown the invasion in the surf, to make the beaches so terrible, so lethal, so completely impossible to cross that the whole enterprise collapsed before it could establish itself. He believed it could be done. He was not certain it could be done, but he believed it, and he worked with furious energy toward that end. But here's the complication, the one that would ultimately prove fatal to German chances on June 6, 1944. Rommel's theory of defense put him in direct and irreconcilable conflict with the other major German commander responsible for France. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who served as Commander-in-Chief West, held a diametrically opposite view. Rundstedt believed in a mobile defense. He wanted to hold the panzer reserves back from the coast, keep them centrally located, and use them as a powerful counterattacking force once the Allies had committed to their landing and revealed their main axis of advance. His theory was that the beach was not the decisive point. The decisive point was inland, where German armor could maneuver, where the cramped beachhead could be pinched off and destroyed before it grew. Rommel thought this was catastrophically wrong. He argued, based on his experience in North Africa and his understanding of Allied air power, that by 1944, the Luftwaffe simply could not provide the air cover necessary for a mobile reserve to operate freely in daylight. He had watched Allied tactical air power in Tunisia and Italy. He knew what fighter bombers could do to tank columns on open roads in clear weather. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that any attempt to move the panzer reserves toward the beachhead after the invasion had started would be savaged by Allied aircraft before the tanks could arrive in useful strength. His view was that the panzers needed to be at the beach, or as close to it as possible, ready to attack within hours of the first landing, before the Allies could build up their defenses on the sand. "If you wait," he said, "you will move your armor under an air umbrella that will tear it to pieces. It needs to be in position. It needs to move before the bombers arrive in strength. It needs to hit the beach while the Allies are still disorganized, still wet, still trying to figure out where they are." One of his most quoted observations from this period is stark in its precision. He said, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." He was right about the phrase. The dispute with Rundstedt, which neither man could resolve because Hitler refused to give either of them full authority, ultimately led to a compromise that served no one. The panzer reserves were split. Some were placed closer to the coast under Rommel's influence. Others were held back as a central reserve that required Hitler's personal permission to move. And on June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed at Normandy, Hitler was asleep. His staff was afraid to wake him. The panzer reserves sat immobile for critical hours while the Allies consolidated their beachhead. By the time the armor moved, it moved under the exact air umbrella that Rommel had predicted. Columns were attacked on roads. Fuel convoys were bombed. Bridges were hit. Movement that should have taken hours took days. And the days the Allies needed to establish themselves were purchased at the cost of German hesitation and structural paralysis. Rommel had foreseen this. He had fought against the command arrangement that caused it. He had lost the argument, and on the day it mattered most, everything he had feared came true. There's something almost unbearably poignant about the position Rommel was in during the spring of 1944. He was a man who understood, better than almost anyone in the German command structure, what was about to happen and why it couldn't be stopped. He had the tactical intelligence to see the situation clearly. He had the moral clarity, increasingly, to understand that the war was lost and that continuing it was simply accumulating more death and destruction without any corresponding strategic purpose. But he was also, at least until very late in the story, a soldier. He operated within a command structure. He had given oaths. He had a sense of personal honor that was deeply intertwined with the obligations of his profession. He was not a Nazi in any ideological sense. His son Manfred later wrote extensively about this, and the historical record is fairly clear. Rommel was not a member of the party, did not participate in the Holocaust, and in North Africa specifically, there is documented evidence that he refused to carry out orders to execute Jewish prisoners and civilians. He was a soldier fighting for Germany, which in 1944 was not the same thing as fighting for Hitler, at least in Rommel's own moral framework, even if the practical distinction was harder to maintain than that. What Rommel was doing in the spring of 1944, as Eisenhower was in London building the greatest invasion force in history, was walking a tightrope between professional duty and a growing recognition that his country was being led to destruction by a man who would not listen to reality. The senior German officers who were organizing or sympathizing with the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler had been trying to bring Rommel into their orbit. Some of them believed that if the assassination succeeded, Rommel's name and reputation would be necessary to stabilize Germany and negotiate with the Western Allies. Rommel himself was, at various times, more or less aware of what was being discussed. His exact level of involvement is one of the more contested questions in the historiography of the period. What seems clear is that by mid-1944 he had moved to the position that Hitler needed to be removed from power, that Germany needed to find a way out of the war, and that he was willing to use his influence and reputation toward that end, whether or not he was specifically committed to the assassination itself. But all of that was still in the future in December of 1943, when Eisenhower's appointment was announced. At that moment, Rommel was still focused on the military problem, on how to make the beaches as deadly as possible, on how to position his forces optimally, on how to make the case to Hitler and to Rundstedt and to OKW for the defensive philosophy he believed offered the only real chance of survival. He drove his engineers and his troops with relentless energy. Millions of obstacles went into the water. Mines went into the sand by the hundreds of thousands, eventually by the millions. Field fortifications were strengthened. Artillery positions were surveyed and improved. Communication lines were laid. He inspected sectors personally, showing up unannounced, asking hard questions, fixing what was broken, and pushing everyone around him to work faster and harder and smarter. And yet he knew. There are letters from this period, letters to his wife Lucy, that were later published, that have a quality that is different from his earlier correspondence. The energy is still there, the precision, the professionalism, but there's something underneath it that reads like a man who is doing everything in his power while quietly acknowledging to himself that power may not be enough. He writes about the beauty of the Norman countryside. He writes about the spring flowers coming up along the roads. He writes about missing home, missing his son, missing the life that the war had been eating for so many years. He writes about his hope that things might work out, but the hope has a quality of will rather than confidence. He is willing it to be true rather than believing it is true. The distinction matters. Meanwhile, in London, Eisenhower was doing what Eisenhower did. He was building a machine. He had inherited a planning staff that had been working on Overlord under General Morgan for over a year. One of his first acts was to push for an expansion of the landing frontage. Morgan's original plan called for a 3-division assault on a relatively narrow front. Eisenhower, with his chief ground commander Bernard Montgomery, who for all his personal friction with Eisenhower was a careful and thorough planner, agreed that this was insufficient. The assault needed to go in on 5 beaches simultaneously, across a broader front, with 5 divisions landing on the first tide, plus airborne operations on both flanks. The expansion required more landing craft, which meant a delay in the original May target date to June. It required an enormous increase in the air preparation, the bombing of transportation targets across France to cripple German movement before the invasion. It required deception operations of unprecedented sophistication, the whole elaborate machinery of Operation Bodyguard, and its component parts, designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. And it required the management of an alliance that included, among its senior commanders, men like Patton and Montgomery, who had enormous capabilities and enormous egos, and who did not always operate well together without firm and steady management from above. Eisenhower managed all of it. Not perfectly, because nothing of that scale can be done perfectly. But effectively, he dealt with Churchill's periodic anxieties about the operation. He dealt with Roosevelt's political concerns. He dealt with the landing craft shortage. He dealt with the debate over whether to bomb French transportation targets, which would inevitably kill French civilians, and which de Gaulle's Free French forces had strong feelings about. He made the final call on the weather window in June, one of the most consequential tactical decisions in military history, choosing to go on June 6th despite marginal weather conditions rather than wait for the next window 2 weeks later, because his meteorologist told him the brief improvement on the 6th was real, even if it wouldn't look perfect. That decision, made in the early hours of June 5th at Southwick House outside Portsmouth, with the rain coming sideways through the windows and his senior commanders sitting around a table waiting for him to speak, was the kind of decision that only one man in that room could make, and he made it. Go. Rommel was not at his headquarters on June 6, 1944. This is one of the great painful ironies of D-Day. He was in Germany, visiting his wife on her birthday, and planning to drive to Berchtesgaden to see Hitler and argue once more for the positioning of the Panzer reserves. He had left France on June 5th, because the weather was so bad that the Allied meteorologists and the German meteorologists both agreed an invasion was unlikely in the immediate future. This was one of the most consequential weather misreads in military history, and it wasn't entirely the Germans' fault. The weather window that Eisenhower's team identified, a brief 24 to 36-hour improvement in an otherwise terrible pattern, was genuinely difficult to see. The German Naval Meteorological Service simply didn't spot it. And so Rommel was at home in Herlingen when the telephone rang in the early morning of June 6th, and he was told that paratroopers had landed in Normandy, that the fleet had appeared out of the dark, that the beaches were under assault, that the invasion had begun. He began driving back immediately. The drive took hours, and during those hours, in France, everything was happening. At Utah Beach, the American forces landed off course, but the off-course position turned out to be better defended than the planned one, and the landing went relatively smoothly. At Omaha Beach, the story was completely different. A story of near-catastrophic losses in the first waves, of men cut down in the surf by interlocking machine gun fire, of bodies rolling in the tide, of companies losing half their strength in the first 30 minutes. Omaha almost failed. It came genuinely close to failing. But the Americans did not stop. They kept going. Individual acts of leadership at the small unit level, sergeants and lieutenants and captains making decisions and moving forward, and dragging their men with them, eventually turned the tide. By the end of the day, they were on the beach. They were not going to be thrown back into the sea. At the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the story was mixed but ultimately successful. Casualties varied, progress varied, but by nightfall, the Allies were ashore. The lodgment existed. The thing that Rommel had staked everything on preventing had happened. The Panzer Reserves, the forces that should have been moving toward the beaches in the first hours, were still waiting for Hitler's permission. Hitler was asleep. The permission didn't come until late afternoon. By then, the window that Rommel had always said was the decisive window had closed. The Allies were on the sand. They were building. The machine was running. When Rommel returned to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon that evening, he did not make dramatic speeches. He did not rage or despair in the theatrical way. He assessed the situation with the cold clarity that characterized him at his best and worst. He looked at the reports. He understood what they meant, and he began the process of trying to organize a coherent defense, knowing already, at some level, that the strategic context had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. He continued to fight. The battles in Normandy over the following weeks were brutal, attritional, and costly on both sides. The bocage country, the dense Norman hedgerows, turned out to be a defensive nightmare for the Allies and a tactical asset for the Germans that nobody had fully planned for. The British and Canadians around Caen fought some of the most grinding battles of the entire Western War. The Americans in the bocage suffered and adapted and eventually found a way through. And through all of it, the Allied air forces did exactly what Rommel had predicted they would do, making daylight movement of German armor dangerous and costly, hitting supply lines, burning fuel dumps, attacking every convoy that moved in daylight. Germany was being strangled from the air even as it fought on the ground. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was in a staff car traveling near Liverat in Normandy when British Spitfires attacked the vehicle. The car went off the road. Rommel suffered serious head injuries and was evacuated to hospital. He was out of the war as a combat commander from that moment. He would never command in the field again. 3 days later, on July 20th, the bomb exploded under the conference table at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. Claus von Stauffenberg's assassination attempt came within inches of success. Hitler survived. The reprisals that followed were swift and sweeping and merciless. Thousands were arrested, hundreds were executed, some in ways of calculated horror, filmed by the regime as a warning to others, and the net of suspicion was cast wide, including over Rommel, whose name had been mentioned by some of the conspirators under interrogation. The question of what Rommel actually knew, what he had agreed to, what he had been planning, became a question of life and death in the most literal sense. By October of 1944, Hitler had made his decision. 2 generals were sent to Rommel's home in Herlingen, where he was still recovering from his head injuries. They offered him a choice, a public trial for treason, which would mean death for him and reprisals against his family, or suicide with a state funeral, a hero's burial, and protection for his wife and son. Rommel asked his son Manfred to leave the room. He spoke with his wife. He told her what was being offered and what it meant. And then, on October 14th, 1944, he got into a car with the two generals, and within minutes he was dead. Cyanide. The official announcement said he had died of complications from his July wounds. He was given a state funeral. Hitler sent a wreath. The propaganda machine made him a hero to the end. Manfred Rommel was 15 years old. He learned the truth about how his father died only later, and spent much of the rest of his long life. He became the longtime mayor of Stuttgart and a major public figure in post-war Germany, working to preserve his father's real history and legacy, including the complexity of a man who served Germany without endorsing what Germany had become under Hitler, who fought with skill and integrity even in a cause that had no moral foundation, and who in the end was murdered by the regime he served because he could no longer serve it in good conscience. Eisenhower, for his part, was in France when Rommel died, commanding the forces that were by then breaking out of Normandy and racing across France. Paris had been liberated in late August. The Allied advance was moving faster than anyone had dared plan for. The logistics were straining almost to breaking point, the subject of fierce debate between commanders about who should get the fuel and whose offensive should be prioritized. Eisenhower, as always, was managing, mediating, making decisions, holding the coalition together through the friction and the ego and the competing national priorities that could have torn it apart at any point. He was doing the thing that Rommel had recognized in him when the appointment was announced, the thing that the German intelligence assessment had called a limitation, and that was actually his greatest strength. The war in the West would continue for another 7 months after Rommel's death. There would be the disaster of Market Garden in September. There would be the shock of the Ardennes offensive in December, what Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major Western gamble, which briefly threatened to crack the Allied line before being contained and then crushed. There would be the crossing of the Rhine, the race into Germany, the end. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Eisenhower received the surrender documents at Reims. The war in Europe was over. But let's go back to December of 1943, because that moment, Rommel hearing the name Eisenhower, deserves a little more examination from a different angle. Because there's something in that moment that speaks to a question that military historians have debated for decades. What makes a great commander? What is the quality, or the combination of qualities, that determines whether a man can take an enormous and complicated military enterprise and make it succeed? Rommel's claim to greatness is intuitive and emotional. He was a man who could read a battlefield in motion, who could feel the momentum of an engagement shifting and respond to it faster than his opponents could process what was happening. He led from the front. He was physically present at points of crisis. He inspired his soldiers through personal example. He improvised with genius. He made the most of limited resources through energy and creativity and sheer tactical brilliance. He was, in the pure craft of battle, one of the most gifted commanders of the 20th century. Any honest assessment of the North African campaign has to acknowledge that he did more with less than almost anyone else in that war. But Eisenhower's claim to greatness is different, and in some ways harder to see clearly because it operates at a different level of abstraction. Eisenhower was not a battlefield genius. He was not going to win a fight against Rommel by outmaneuvering him at the tactical level. What Eisenhower could do was something that the industrial age of warfare had made arguably more decisive than tactical brilliance. He could build and maintain and direct a machine of enormous complexity over an extended period of time while managing the human relationships that kept that machine from tearing itself apart. He could hold Patton and Montgomery in the same coalition. He could tell Churchill no when Churchill needed to be told no, and do it in a way that preserved the relationship and the alliance. He could make the call to go on June 6th, with all the uncertainty and all the weight of what was at stake, and then get on with the next problem. He was, in the deepest sense, a manager of organized violence at the scale that the Second World War demanded, and that scale was unlike anything that had come before. What Rommel said when he heard Eisenhower was taking command was, in essence, an acknowledgement of this. He didn't say, "It will be easy." He didn't say, "We will beat him." He said, through the careful, measured, honest language of a man who had run out of comfortable illusions, that what was coming was serious, that the appointment meant the Allies were organized and committed, and would bring everything they had to bear, and that Germany needed to meet that reality with its own seriousness and clarity. He was recognizing in Eisenhower something that the more dismissive German assessments failed to see. He was recognizing a peer, not a peer in tactics or in battlefield command, but a peer in the broader craft of war. A man who understood the full scope of what was required, and who had the qualities to attempt it. There's a famous quotation that's often attributed to Rommel, though like many famous quotations from the war, its precise origins are somewhat murky in the historical record. The quotation is that before the war, he would have given anything to command an army like the one the Allies possessed, with their material resources and their air power and their capacity for sustained organized effort. After the war started, he said, essentially, that such a command would have been worth 10 times anything he had actually been given. Whether those exact words are precisely verified or not, they capture something real about his understanding of the material balance of the war. He knew, in a way that his political masters refused to accept, that Germany was fighting a coalition that could replace what it lost faster than Germany could replace its own losses. That was the fundamental arithmetic, and Eisenhower was the man charged with making that arithmetic decisive. The relationship between Rommel's reputation and Eisenhower's reputation in the post-war period is itself interesting. Rommel became, very quickly after the war, a somewhat idealized figure in the Western narrative of the conflict. The narrative of the clean soldier, the honorable enemy, the skilled commander who was untainted by Nazi ideology and who ultimately died rather than serve a murderous regime. This narrative is not entirely false, but it is simplified. Rommel served that regime for years. He was used by it as a propaganda tool. His victories in North Africa were used by Goebbels to sell the German people on the righteousness and capability of Hitler's war. The relationship between Rommel the professional soldier and Rommel the celebrity of the Nazi state is complicated, and serious historians have wrestled with those complications for decades. But the Western embrace of Rommel as the good German general was also partly a product of the Cold War need for a rehabilitated Germany as an ally, and partly a genuine recognition that his military skill was real, and his character, in the personal and professional sense, was relatively decent by the standards of the senior German officer corps in that war. He didn't run extermination camps. He didn't organize mass executions. He fought. He fought hard and well, and against enormous odds, and with a certain chivalric quality toward his opponents that was notable in that context. That counts for something, even if it doesn't resolve all the contradictions. Eisenhower's post-war reputation went through different phases. He was, immediately after the war, the most celebrated American soldier since Grant. He became president. He served 2 terms. He left office with the famous warning about the military-industrial complex, a speech that showed a depth of strategic and political thinking that surprised people who had categorized him only as a general. Then came the revisionist phase, where historians began to pick at the decisions and the compromises and the things that went wrong. The broad front strategy versus the narrow thrust strategy, the Arnhem operation, the failure to close the Falaise Gap fully, the decision to let the Soviets take Berlin. Each of these has been debated exhaustively, and on each of them there are serious arguments on multiple sides. Then came a more balanced reassessment, which is roughly where the serious historical literature sits today, acknowledging that Eisenhower's strategic decisions were not always optimal at the operational level, while insisting that his ability to hold the coalition together and keep the Allied war machine functioning through an enormously complicated campaign was itself a form of strategic genius that should not be minimized. What connects Rommel and Eisenhower, what makes their story more than just a tale of 2 generals on opposing sides of a war, is that their respective strengths and weaknesses illuminate something fundamental about the nature of warfare at the scale of the Second World War. Rommel's kind of generalship, intuitive, aggressive, tactically brilliant, personally present, was the kind that had decided battles throughout military history. It was the kind that Napoleon exemplified. It was the kind that celebrated generals from Caesar to Wellington had practiced. And it was still valuable in 1944. There is no question about that, but by 1944, the decisive level of the war had moved above the tactical and even the operational. The decisive level was industrial. It was logistical. It was organizational. The side that could sustain and replace and supply at the greatest scale over the greatest distance with the greatest consistency was, all other things being roughly equal, the side that was going to win. And Rommel knew this. He had watched it happen in North Africa. He had felt it in the contrast between what the Afrika Korps could do on a good day with enough fuel and what it could do after the supply lines were cut and the petrol was gone. He understood the material arithmetic, and when he heard Eisenhower's name in December of 1943, he understood that the man who had been charged with making that arithmetic decisive was serious, capable,